Deadly Premonition divided the video game audience in half when it was released in 2010. While the game's massive technical problems saw a lot of players dismiss it outright, others would claim that the game's story more than made up for those problems. How could a developer knowingly ship a game with so many problems when it clearly had so much potential?
FBI Special Agent, Francis York Morgan. Please, just call me York.
Just before I get started, I'd like to drop in a bit of a foreword so that the rest of the video can stay focused on discussing the game, and the more sensitive issues are laid out first for anyone concerned about them. Deadly Premonition was released in 2010 and was developed by a Japanese team. Topics like homosexuality, transgender people, and sexual assault were not handled in a mature and careful way in Japan, although things have improved very slightly. If a poorly handled homosexual or trans character is upsetting to you, then I cannot recommend you play this game. If you are similarly upset by depictions of violence against women and an instance of implied sexual assault, then I would also recommend that you not continue too deeply into this video. Deadly Premonition also contains some very intense violence that is plot significant, and I will be sure to warn you at those moments if you'd prefer not to see it. Now, with that out of the way, let's get going.
Now it's totally abandoned.
Development costs at the start of HD gaming were astronomically high, and a large percentage of active video game developers were not profitable enough to continue operation once the industry had made the transition. The gigantic wave of closures affected companies across the world, including studios I've spoken about before, but arguably the most devastated region was the Japanese video game industry. Attempting to remain as ambitious as they had been during the previous era was the most common cause of Japanese developer demise, but trying to cut corners to reduce some of the development cost could also have disastrous consequences. Thor High Heels coined the term "skung" to describe the common visual issues that would come as a result of desperate cost cutting, and I think the term is onomatopoeically appropriate. Sometimes though, a developer wouldn't be dissuaded from creating something excessively scungy if it allowed them to continue pursuing their ambitions, and in 2010, Access Games would epitomize HD game development on a budget with their survival horror title, Deadly Premonition. The game features a tiny number of enemies, no more than a handful of musical pieces, and some critically awful animation culling, and yet the game's narrative and writing are so excellent that the overall experience is of incredibly high quality. Reception to Deadly Premonition was as mixed as the game itself, but the sales were sufficient enough for the developer to keep its doors open to this day. So what was specifically so fantastic about the game's narrative? Were the technical issues enough to prevent Deadly Premonition from earning widespread critical acclaim? And most importantly, how could Access Games ship Deadly Premonition, knowing it had the problems that it does? The footage for this video was recorded on stream. If you'd like to chat about games and videos, as well as get notifications for when I go live, join the Discord in the description.
Bishop takes queen. His rook takes your queen. Then your knight takes rook. And checkmate.
Huh? Oh. My first victory in the Grandmaster ranking.
So stupid. Look at how cool he is. He can do chess. Uh-oh. With the release of the PlayStation 2 in 2000, Sony was seeking to create a number of first-party properties for their new system as insurance, in case their third-party partners struck up exclusivity deals with Sony's competitors. Capcom could not be relied upon to bring their popular franchises to the PS2, so Sony would begin development of their own survival horror game to fill the void. That game, Extermination, developed by Sony's Deep Space, was released in 2001 to middling reviews and middling sales. The narrative similarities to John Carpenter's The Thing were noted as a major strength for Extermination, but the game failed to perform to Sony's expectations, and Deep Space would be closed shortly afterward, leaving a fairly competent development team without a home. Access Games would waste no time in salvaging the ex-Deep Space team and keep much of their previous structure intact. This meant job security for some, and promotions for others, and Extermination's lead designer, Hidetake Suehiro, would land himself a game director role under the new ownership. Suehiro, nicknamed Swery, had a number of concepts ready to go, and would lead the team to create a stealth action game, Spy Fiction, for the PlayStation 2 in 2003. Spy Fiction would sell well enough for the studio to stay afloat, while the team began work on their new project, codenamed Rainy Woods. The project would be worked on for 3 full years before being scrapped in 2007, meaning that Access would have to rely on some porting work before they could consider returning to original titles. With the release of the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 in 2005 and 6 respectively, Access's ambitions were reignited, and the technical issues that had caused Rainy Woods' cancellation were no longer as detrimental as they had been. Rainy Woods was reopened, and eventually shipped in 2010, now known as Deadly Premonition. To describe Deadly Premonition's reception at release as polarizing would be an understatement. IGN's Eric Brudvig said in their closing comments,
"Terrible controls, terrible pacing, terrible sound effects, terrible visuals. Maybe you can convince yourself that these things don't matter as you work through the surreal and quirky storyline. The rest of us will be off playing better video games."
Meanwhile, Jim Sterling said in their Destructoid review that,
"There is absolutely nothing in this industry that can compare to how weird and wonderful the whole experience is. Judged as a piece of entertainment, and as a game that constantly surprises and amazes and leaves jaws hanging, I have no choice but to say that Deadly Premonition goes above and beyond. It's pretty close to perfect."
And then gave the game a perfect score. This huge variation in reception seemed to hinge entirely upon the reviewer's opinion toward how valuable a narrative is to a game, as well as whether the game could be considered an art piece. One's ability to look beyond the surface layers and appraise that aspect of the game seemed to have been the difference between 2s and 9s, and while I like to think that I would fall into that category of appraisers, I cannot deny that the technical problems within Deadly Premonition did detract from my experience. Looking back at early Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 games is a perilous journey into a well-repressed stage of the video game industry's history. Standard definition and the smaller resolution would allow the weaker assets to blend into the environments or be hidden off screen, but with the improved fidelity, there was nowhere for any mistakes to hide. Furthermore, the video game playing public were expecting higher poly counts and higher texture resolutions, which meant more development time would have to be devoted to accumulating these assets. While the new hardware was capable of rendering more polygons at a time, the true upper limit, as well as effective optimization strategies, weren't fully available to every developer. So many of the early HD games have a swathe of issues that are caused by optimization failings, or simply overpopulating environments with too many polygons. As a result, many games within the secondary waves of releases would contain rather barren environments, as many of the assets would have been stripped out in an attempt to improve performance. Creating all of this took much longer than previous generation games had taken to develop, so the ability to continue to release games annually became entirely restricted to a handful of the largest studios. Smaller teams would have to create competitive games, with significantly fewer resources, at a greatly reduced scale, less frequently, but on an extremely tight schedule, without access to the breadth of knowledge present within the biggest studios, or influence over the hardware companies to get any assistance from them directly. Every game would have to be special in some hyper-focused way, and they'd have to hit those heights consistently in order to stay afloat. Deadly Premonition is hyper-focused on delivering an interesting story at the cost of much of the rest of the game. While stability is not a problem for Deadly Premonition, the means by which Access Games remedied that issue was by mauling a significant portion of the presentation. A trick implemented by many games with long render distances is to cull the animation frames for entities far enough into the distance to reduce the amount of rendering the hardware would have to engage in. You might notice this in modern games, as it does a lot to keep things running smoothly around the player, while also allowing things to happen emergently in another location. Deadly Premonition has implemented this animation culling, but its range is far too short. It isn't uncommon for in-engine movies to have a camera positioned in such a way as to put one or more characters beyond the culling range. There are so many instances of one half of the conversation occurring in a crispy 30 frames a second, while the second party responds at a jagged 5. Increasing the culling range would have resolved this problem, but even the director's cut, released 3 years later, still has this culling mistake. There are other frame rate issues occasionally as well, outside of the culling range, but they're infrequent and short enough to not be too much of a concern. Excluding the times there are multiple cameras on screen though. I can't really tell what this is supposed to add, but it is not to the benefit of the performance. The presentation as a whole is just as likely to leave those with a lower tolerance for imperfections looking for another game to play. Deadly Premonition was not a particularly appealing looking game at release, and time has not been gentle to these graphics. The human characters are unfortunately good enough to not look stylish in any way, which means they all have uncanniness problems. York looks okay. His hair is a little strange, but the model is pretty good. But York regularly hangs out with George, who appears to be melting. Most of the other characters all look just fine, and the uncanniness is quite appropriate when it's present within the horror segments, but the animations aren't afforded any leeway. York's thinking animation where he taps his chest doesn't actually connect with his body, and his smile kinda looks like a Gmod animation. The rest of the cast use the same collection of pre-made animations, which are sometimes awfully inappropriate. Some of these animations completely disrupt the tone of the game, much like one or two of the songs or every time a character speaks outdoors.
Is this government land?
No, it's private. Owned by Harry.
This whole area?
That's right. I'm sure I mentioned that he owns pretty much the whole town.
He used the money left by his father to buy up most of the town.
A character might have just been brutally killed, but here's this dog, so the silly jazz music has to play.
Hey, Willie. Are you here with your owner?
The musical pieces are generally pretty good, but there are so few of them that I got tired of them quite quickly. The game's palette is similarly tiring, but it's also relevant to the game's setting. Greenvale is a tiny town in the northwest of the United States, a location that is infamously wet, and a region that values its traditions and superstitions. Presenting a town like this in greens and greys both excellently reflects the overarching tone of the experience, and it makes the significantly colourful aspects that much more visible. Deadly Premonition's plot often revolves around the presence of some mysterious red seeds, which are visually distinctive, and the red trees that drop the seeds allow the player a vision of the evil in the area. Although, the palette during horror time isn't a lot different to how the game looks normally. And without the wiggly red vines, I'm not sure I'd have been able to tell if it was spooky time or not in some locations. Some games just seem assembled naturally. A room looks the way it does because the real-life equivalent would look that way. Other games have characters with odd idiosyncrasies, who live in houses with unusual furniture layouts or dress in a very particular way. There's something about the details that have been paid attention that shows the game's director wants to convey something important to the player. Deadly Premonition is occasionally incredibly directed. The layout of the hospital is a confusing maze of hallways that all look the same, and under the circumstances where a person is dramatically rushed through a hospital, they will most likely get that impression. Moreover, whenever the game does shift into horror mode, the way the layouts of the familiar locations are twisted and contorted into distantly familiar tangles places the player in an uncomfortable situation. The feeling of being lost, while still kind of recognizing one's surroundings, is a major reason why dementia is so harrowing. As a general idea, the horror segments are fantastic, but the direction cannot carry them out of their technical failings. Other areas in the game are strangely, atrociously directed. Movies that are demonstrating the broad carnage that tore through Greenvale, inflicting an uncontrollable violent urge onto the entire population, only really show a handful of people waving weapons around. At one stage, a mob of people attack one of the buildings, but there are so few people in the group that it hardly qualifies as a mob. These animations could have been created externally and played as a movie instead of using the engine and all of its limitations. And I have to add, shoving the least subtle spoilers into some of these does not serve the game's narrative in any way. Fortunately, these few mistakes are blemishes on the game's primary design. The player will engage with two primary gameplay systems throughout their adventure in Greenvale: the exploration of the regular world and the survival horror segments that mainly occur in interior spaces. Greenvale and all of the buildings within it have been assembled as though the town is a real place. And I don't mean that in the normal game critic sense. I mean it genuinely is arranged like that stereotypical small American town. And all of the buildings have mechanically useless bathrooms and bedrooms for every resident. The townsfolk seem to have very detailed schedules, which includes eating meals and commuting to their jobs. If the player needs to interact with anyone specifically, they'll need to know where they'll be at what time. There are a couple of methods to get to these locations. York's walking and running speeds are good enough, although the stamina mechanic seems unnecessary. The interior distances are small anyway, but since the town is realistically proportioned, it's usually not a good use of time to travel anywhere on foot. That's where the driving comes in, and it's fairly awkward. The cars are almost totally weightless, and Access have tried to imitate weight by making the steering appalling. There doesn't appear to be any kind of standard braking, just a handbrake that causes the car to rotate 180 degrees, and the reverse gear. So when the car finally makes it to that maximum speed of 50 miles per hour, slowing down to turn corners is either a dramatic movie car chase spin, or not actually effective enough to turn tightly. I can't say I hated it though. Car time was usually filled with fun nonsense that suddenly takes the edge off of the controls.
I went to see every Richard Donner movie on the day they premiered. Every single one. Goonies, Lost Boys, the Lethal Weapon series, but my favorite has to be Lady Hawk. That was back in 1985. Same year as Goonies. Both Rutger Hauer and Michelle Pfeiffer really shine in that one.
Upon finally reaching the destination, there's a high likelihood that the horror mechanics will hustle in and take over the gameplay. York can arm himself in these scenarios, and there are a few different weapons to choose from. The player will typically have access to a knife and a blunt weapon to beat zombies and obstacles with, as well as a standard issue pistol with unlimited bullets, and also a few other firearms with collectible ammunition. Fighting in melee is as basic as things can be. York can swing his weapon and maybe it'll hit and deal damage. When aiming with a gun, however, the game becomes a proper full-fledged action horror game like Resident Evil 4. Body Harvest.
That's what I thought.
It's archaic and clunky, but not to the game's detriment. The enemies are slow, but threatening enough to make their advances tense. Considering how clumsy the rest of the game has seemed to this point, the controls during the combat segments are remarkably well done, and the only bugs are the ones that occasionally fly around York. Deadly Premonition has some immersive mechanics that I don't really see a need for, and they've been sidelined so thoroughly that I suspect Access might have felt the same. Greenvale is a living community, and so the people within it have to fulfill their various needs to stay alive. This means York has to eat food sometimes, go to bed sometimes, and wash his clothes sometimes. York's beard will also grow, and the player can choose to shave it or not. What purpose these systems serve seems to have been lost within the end product, but the player will still have to manage these occasionally. When I first noticed York's beard growth, I was suddenly reminded of the horse testicle shrinking mechanic they put into Red Dead 2, because it seems to be just as unnecessary. If York's clothes are dirty, then he'll be surrounded by a swarm of gigantic flying insects that persist into places I wasn't expecting. They'll follow him into the car, and into scripted movies, into the horror segments, everywhere. I can't imagine someone noticing that the insects are linked to York's wardrobe cleanliness. I originally thought they were just part of the building I had entered, and their continued presence was a bug. Hunger and tiredness are closely tied to the game's time. If 18 hours passes in game, York will be desperately searching for a bed to take a nap in. However, whenever York enters the horror segments, he is transported into some kind of parallel dimension where the passage of time doesn't occur in the same way, or even at all. York can spend hours at a crime scene, wandering through the twisted labyrinth searching for clues, but he won't get hungry. Even stranger is that most save rooms within the horror portions contain somewhere to sleep, and on occasion a briefcase to change clothes. But time doesn't pass. Was it possible to starve to death in the Nightmare Art Gallery in a previous build of the game? Or pass out from exhaustion while running away from a monster, so they just disabled the system entirely? Why bother with it through the rest of the game then? As I mentioned earlier, Greenvale is a relatively accurate model of a rural town in the northwest of the US mainland, but it was also created on a tiny budget for the first HD video game consoles, so Access has made some concessions. The town has two main clumps of buildings that each revolve around a primary purpose: housing or services, as well as a few outlier locations like the hospital and the lumber mill. York meets whoever he needs to get a task from within one of the clusters, and then usually has to drive out to one of the outlier locations where the majority of the game takes place. The commutes are fine, quite enjoyable actually, but the town's jagged, low-poly geography can be quite the immersion destroyer, and the car hates the seams too. I never flipped it, but turning certain corners while climbing hills made it seem very possible. How much dev time would it have taken to smooth the roads out? I can't imagine it would have been much. The walkable area outside of the town is partitioned by strange berms that York can't climb or drive over. They honestly make the environments uglier than if they had just been some invisible walls or fences in the way. The forest looks fantastic otherwise, and while there isn't a lot to find out there, I think having less of it would have drastically reduced the player's perception of the size of the map. The population within Greenvale is an odd collection of extreme caricatures placed alongside a rather reasonable cast, and then they intermingle in bizarre ways. A small town horror setting would be incomplete without some creepy twins, and their mother and grandfather accommodate them in the setting well. But their father? Keith was one of the first people I interacted with during the Big Town Summit because he was flailing about and snapping his fingers as part of his walk cycle. York just briefed the entire town on the murder that had taken place, and asked for their cooperation in the investigation. And then this dude totally breaks the mood by being this ridiculous rocker character. Seeing him beside his wife is so strange. He doesn't keep this character up the entire time either, so his introduction is jarring without commitment. The more central cast within the Greenvale police initially appeared to be more caricatures, but their identities become well filled out as the game goes on. The first few interactions the player has with George make him appear as a comic relief character, but quickly he is changed into York's straight man. Unfortunately, George's characterization continues to spiral further away from consistency, and his position as the town's sheriff becomes more and more questionable as the game goes on. To avoid spoilers before an adequate warning, George may actually be the worst part about this game because of his frankly atrocious motivations. Aspiring writers, never have your adult character scream, "I'm sorry, mommy," at the sky. That's like unironically writing the end after your story concludes. Thomas and Emily are significantly better written characters, although they aren't without their shortcomings. Thomas's introduction is especially entertaining as they task York to locate a key with a particular squirrel on the keyring, but never bother to tell York anything useful about the features of the squirrel they're actually looking for. It's a shame these characters aren't as well rounded as they could have been, but what the supporting cast lack, the star more than makes up for. Francis York Morgan is a fascinating, goofy, apparently professional detective with what appears to be a personal obsession with the case of the Red Seeds. The player is introduced to York going over his mental notes as he's driving toward Greenvale during a rainstorm. This introduction makes the player's terrible driving canon, as York manages to be on the phone and smoke a cigarette while driving, and inevitably he flips his car and ends up lost in the forest. When York finally emerges from the trees and meets the town's police department, he introduces himself in the same, almost childlike way that he will every time he meets someone new. Something about the way he stands there showing his badge to whomever he just met and going through his introductory monologue was funny to me every time. And I kind of believe that the childish way this introduction appears was deliberate, and that it has something to do with Zach.
Zach, we may as well have fun if we're getting lost.
Throughout the entire game, York will make comments to someone named Zach. York goes over his thoughts with Zach, makes light conversation with them, and even stops talking with the people in front of him to confer with Zach as an aside. But despite York reaching for his ear whenever he does talk to Zach, he isn't actually wearing an earpiece. Zach isn't another character. Zach might be the player, or Zach could be a component of a mental illness that York has, or Zach is York's imaginary friend from his childhood. Deadly Premonition does explain who Zach is, but we still aren't into the narrative section yet, so I'll just mention that the revelation is absurd, infuriating, and yet it also manages to be quite satisfying. I believed York was speaking directly to the player for a few hours, and then I felt that York was impaired with a hyperactive imagination until the answer was revealed. York solves a chess puzzle by glancing at it. He stares into his coffee to read his own fortune. He spends a lot of time thinking about the movies he wants to rewatch, and manages to find tangible evidence within the nightmare versions of the locations he enters, meaning that he is actually walking around and looking at stuff while the building's layouts and contents have been warped in his imagination. From this point forward, I'm going to get into the horror elements and the game's narrative and writing. If you don't want spoilers for those things, then this is where you depart and play the game yourself. I'll see you when you get back. Despite the game's big open world filled with silly characters and side quests, Deadly Premonition is a horror game, and will regularly lock the player into the horror segments to shoot zombies that go, yeah. These guys aren't scary, but the Raincoat Killer has some more frightening ideas to get the player spooked. He'll badly play hide and seek with York, he'll engage a second camera to annihilate the frame rate, the player has to wiggle the stick back and forth to make York run away from the axe-wielding murderer, and then there are a healthy quantity of QuickTime events to contend with just for good measure. The Raincoat Killer is much more effective at murdering women in brutal, ritualistic ways, however. The first victim, and the reason York made his way to Greenvale in the first place, was a young woman who had been force-fed some red seeds, then had her tongue bitten off, then was slashed from the sternum down before being hung from a tree in the forest. York wasn't present for Anna's death, and so the ritualistic murder can be held at arm's length, and is a relatively gentle entry into the investigation. Comparatively, Becky's death is so distressing and sadistic that I don't really feel comfortable showing it. Becky was similarly force-fed the red seeds, had her tongue bitten out, and was slashed in the same way, but she is still alive when the player finds her strung up in her bathroom. This scene is extremely upsetting, as Becky screams in tongueless fear as George and Thomas fall into the killer's trap and cause Becky to be killed by the setup. To go from the light-hearted Scooby and the gang stuff to this gave me an intense sense of whiplash and had me on edge for the rest of the game. I would learn who the next victims were going to be, but the potential method for their deaths was deeply disturbing. Fortunately, it never gets as severe as this again, but it does get close. Diane's death is dark, but Thomas's is worse for reasons I think are quite distasteful. Thomas is either gay or transgender. I can't really tell, and it seems that Swery might have believed those two things were interchangeable. Thomas uses animations that appeal to the stereotype that gay men are overtly expressive at all times. That somehow there's a gay run and a gay salute. But Thomas also spends a lengthy portion towards the end of the game in a dress and a wig, and fantasizes about being George's woman. Does Thomas enjoy drag, or are they transgender? Either way, they fall off of imaginary clockwork and their face is impaled on a hook. It's extreme, it's shocking, it seems to come without warning. Brutality could just occur at any moment, and the player cannot get complacent so long as they're completing narrative content. Deadly Premonition's narrative has two focuses: the investigation into the Raincoat Killer murders, and some introspection into York's past. York arrives in Greenvale and vows to simply tag along with the local police force's investigation into Anna's murder. After some preliminary investigation at the location of the body, Anna's remains are transported to the local hospital where the post-mortem takes place. York has a look over Anna's body and discovers some mysterious red seeds, the same seeds he had encountered across a string of similar murders throughout the country. He assumes command over the investigation and asks Greenvale Sheriff to summon the entire town's population to the community center to scope them out. This is where the player is introduced to the suspects, aside from two important characters. Upon returning to the hotel that evening, York meets the traveling sapling salesman, Forrest Kaysen, who claims to be the only person who can consistently get a species of red tree to sprout. In the night, York has a dream in which he is walking through a red forest and is approached by a boy in pajamas. The boy guides York past the zombie and through a door, which prompts York to wake up. The gang then travels to meet Diane at her art gallery, where York learns of her domineering sexuality, as well as noticing that one of the clues from Anna's scene could have been attributed to her. York doesn't make any arrests or even informal accusations. He spots Kaysen in Diane's office as he's leaving the gallery, and decides to allow things to play out for a bit. Anna's sister Becky is killed in the meantime, ushering York to speed up the investigation to prevent further casualties. York and Emily are informed that the diner owner might be having an affair with Diane as well, and his standoffish attitude lands him as the primary suspect. That night, York expects Diane and the diner owner to meet at the local bar, which prompts him to organize a big stakeout at the bar. George is posted up at the gallery, Thomas is placed inside the bar, and York and Emily wait in a patrol car outside. They follow the diner owner into the gallery, where George has allowed the Raincoat Killer to slip past his watch and attack Diane. This event eliminates all of York's suspects, and, dejected, he decides to go out for a drink with George. George admits to having some deep psychological damage inflicted by his own mother when he was a child, so York reassures him. Emily arrives, and York spends the rest of the night falling in love with her. The next day, York goes to speak with an elder named Harry, who informs him of an event where the entire population of Greenvale was overcome with uncontrollable aggression and began trying to murder each other. Harry had seen some soldiers pumping a mysterious gas into the town, one of whom looks awfully familiar. While speaking with Harry, Thomas mysteriously disappears, and the gang attempts to track them down. York intuited to go to the bar and look for any details, which leads him to a hidden basement where he learns who is behind the Raincoat killings, and is knocked out. George and Emily team up with Kaysen to continue the search for Thomas, as well as begin looking for York. Kaysen's dog follows York's scent all the way around town, taking the longest path possible to get to wherever Thomas is holding York. For this section, the player gains control of Emily while York is tied to a chair in the town's clock tower. Thomas is the game's first boss battle, and it's okay. Thomas confesses that George is the Raincoat Killer, so York, Emily, and Kaysen head to the police station to confront George. While there, the group finds Carol, Thomas's sister, sliced up with a mouthful of red seeds. In her final moments, she manages to shove a handful of seeds into Emily's mouth. York entrusts Kaysen to take Emily to have her stomach pumped at the hospital, while he goes on to confront George alone. George eats a bunch of the seeds and mutates into a big, apparently invincible monster with a very obvious weak spot in the middle of his back. He transforms a few times throughout the fight and starts yelling apologies to the sky before York takes him down. With George defeated, York passes out and awakens in the hospital. Kaysen had taken York there and given him a map to George's house, where York learns the true depth of the Red Seed's influence. A note directs York to the community center for a final confrontation with Kaysen. The Red Seeds seem to have some hallucinogenic properties, and it's implied that Kaysen had sexually assaulted Emily while she was under the influence. As evidence of the attack, Kaysen had planted one of his red saplings into Emily's body. She asks York to shoot her. She'd rather die than be consumed by the sapling. Lost, York asks Zack for help. As a child, York had witnessed a very similar situation. Kaysen had planted a sapling into York's mother, and she had asked York's father to kill her too. Unable to kill the woman he loves, the sapling suddenly grows larger, draining all of York's mother's life away. As reparations for failing to do the right thing, York's father shoots himself, leaving Zack orphaned. This traumatic event caused the boy to recoil inward, inventing an entirely new person to become to protect Zack from the things he had seen. York wasn't ever real, and Zack has to do the right thing in regards to Emily. Zack similarly fails to shoot Emily. Instead, she dramatically tears the sapling from her body, refusing to allow herself to be corrupted. She doesn't survive this, but the trouble isn't over. Kaysen breaks his illusion and becomes a lengthy 3-phase battle to end the game. Upon vanquishing the evil, Zack gets to meet with York, Emily, Thomas, and all of the other Raincoat victims one last time before leaving Greenvale and heading home. This plot is incredible. As a crime thriller, it leaves no loose ends, nor does it force the answer to be physically impossible, and it leaves enough information in the open for the player to be able to figure out the truth. And if the player does figure out who the villain really is, the story still has some twists that are excellent at sowing doubt. As a horror narrative, there is an ever-present sense of helplessness throughout the entire investigation, which makes the evil that much more threatening. York might be a competent FBI agent and armed with an infinitely reloadable pistol, but those tools aren't enough to fight back against the Raincoat Killer's schemes. Even being present in the room with some of the victims before they die, York still fails to save them. So what good is a gun and a badge? And darkness is only truly dark when contrasted by something light. The jovial conversations in the car, York's excitement when he talks about movies he likes, inadvertently flirting with the hotel manager. These things are necessary to make the tragedy that much more depressing. But while the twists and inter-character relationships are well done, the villains in Deadly Premonition lack any kind of motivation. George's parental issues aren't even mentioned until 10 hours into the game, where they are forcefully shoved in to give him something to be motivated by. But even with this, the reason George and these people entered into this cultish voluntary sacrifice pact is so that George can become invincible. Why does George want to be invincible? His body transforms into a big demonic creature, but what's his plan afterward? It isn't sufficiently explained. Kaysen tricks George into believing that a toy locket is important for the process of becoming invincible, and I can understand that Kaysen would want to be playing with mortals, although his motivation for doing so are as hazy as George's. Kaysen's intention is to force people to kill the ones they love as part of his evil demon tasks, and that doesn't really constitute a motivation either. Does Kaysen have something to gain within the Red Room dimension by planting trees in women, or by causing a town to start uncontrollably killing each other? As it stands, Kaysen's entire purpose is to ruin Zack's life and then mess with York while Zack was hidden away. I wonder if there's some symbolism in this that I just can't see. And unfortunately, the blurring between which events are truly occurring and which aren't puts a lot of the potential metaphor into disarray. The red seeds are very interesting to consider metaphorically. Consuming them is very important to the ritualistic murders of the Raincoat Killer. They seem to have some kind of psychoactive property, and through whatever method Kaysen does so, when placed within the womb of a female victim, they sprout into a fairly advanced tree. Are they a metaphor for a substance that can cause cervical cancer? Or a drug used by violent criminals to sedate their victims? A seed is typically used as a metaphor for the start of something new, but Deadly Premonition's seed only sprouts if it destroys someone else. But is it actually doing that in the reality of the game? York is by no means a reliable narrator, and the player experiences the events through his eyes. So perhaps he has replaced the truth with his own redacted version, or a version that allows him to avoid facing the painful reality. The player is shown that York is very capable of noticing tiny details, and formulating an entire plan quickly and effectively, and his love of movies shows that he has a preference for the fictitious. The director's cut adds a few extra scenes to provide a framing of the game's events, which features Zack after retirement, retelling the story of his investigation in Greenvale to his granddaughter. So not only is York unreliable within the context of the game, but Zack's version of the events being told to a child are likely to be censored and embellished. I think these additional scenes add one too many layers into the mix, and cause a lot of the game's metaphorical ideas to be too deeply muddled to still retain their meaning. It's fun to think about, but I think Swery let the writing get away from him. Deadly Premonition's writing is strange. I know we're quite deep into this thing, and a statement like that is almost insulting, but to truly appraise the writing's quality might be too complicated to do. Swery and Axis Games are Japanese, and I would assume that Deadly Premonition was written in Japanese and then translated into English. But Swery is a very capable dual linguist. His English was often regarded as effectively fluent when being interviewed around Deadly Premonition's original release, so perhaps the awkward sentences are intentional. Sometimes York speaks in very unnatural phrases, so much so that you can hear the actor stumbling over the lines on some occasions. This might be a cultural thing too, as Japanese scriptwriting often forgoes stage direction in favor of having the characters say their thoughts aloud, and leaving the acting up to the actor or the animator. The phrase, "Tell me about your parents," would not be met with the speech Emily delivers if it were not written by a Japanese writer. So picking on these aspects feels like comparing things that should not be compared. However, Kaysen's constant interruptions to the search for York are just very poor quality. Something that has prevented me from writing a script of this length has been a lesson I was taught in regards to wasting the audience's time. The teacher used the phrase, "kill your babies," to mean that no matter how proud of a sentence you might be, you should always return to it to make sure it's even necessary. Writing the most descriptive poetic prose might be fun to do, but nobody's going to read it if it's ultimately substanceless. Kaysen repeatedly interrupting one of the most interesting segments of the game and retelling information that the player already knows does not serve the game at all. This is content that I would naturally remove upon reviewing my own work, and I think whatever purpose Kaysen's interruptions are intended to achieve has been entirely missed. These small hiccups are rare enough that the sense of wasting time will only ever appear in a flash before the valuable content returns. Undoubtedly, there are technical problems and visual unfriendliness that I'm certain have already turned a lot of people off by now. For those more concerned about the narrative, my gripes with some of the components might seem like I think more negatively about this game than I do. Deadly Premonition is a disaster, I won't deny that, but it's such a fascinating experience and genuinely succeeds at far more than it fails. It is a magnificent disaster. One that I highly recommend for anyone who has ever been curious. Don't pretend that the technical hurdles are unscalable. They are, and it is easily worth it. Deadly Premonition was shipped with a lot of problems into a climate that wasn't especially hospitable to those problems. But the game's narrative is such a gigantic step up from anything that it was competing with, and it was good enough for many to overlook the game's flaws. The staff of Access Games went from losing their jobs to just hanging on, and then just about managed to piece together something unimaginably special. To have garnered a cult following is arguably the best fate a game like Deadly Premonition could attain, and I think those who worked on it are very pleased to see people still enjoying their game. Like Devil's Third, I think Access knew things wouldn't be perfect, but enough people would see through the chaos and bad press, and they'd keep talking about Deadly Premonition, so that it would find the right audience in the end. Thanks for watching, and a special thank you to Gwynabelle, the Pretentious Hipster, and Yusuf from Video Game Plot Summaries for helping me out with this one. I've got another big project in the works, but that won't be for another couple of weeks. Next time, I'll be embarking upon my gliding.